Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a book event with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm Kent Lassman, and today I'll be joined by two scholars to dive deep and explain what is happening around the world with politics, specifically political realignment. I'm delighted that we're joined by Dr. Steve Davies to discuss his most recent book, The Economics and Politics of Brexit, The Realignment of British Public Life. It was published just about 6 weeks ago. Now, Steve might be familiar to some of you. He's active on Twitter. He serves as a senior fellow at the AIER and is the head of education at the IEA, our free market friends in London. He's held teaching positions at universities in America and Britain and is trained as a historian, holding degrees from Scotland's St. Andrews University. To help me with the conversation, we'll bring in CEI's Vice President for Strategy and Senior Fellow Iain Murray. Iain has been writing about the contours of contemporary political movements for years, and has a book forthcoming next month exploring these issues. Before I turn to Steve for some opening remarks, I want to remind our viewers that to participate in the conversation, there is a Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. Through the Q&A feature, I'll be able to see your questions and be able to forward them on to Steve and Iain. Steve, I want to start with a note of gratitude. Thank you for the work that you do and for making time to be with us today. To get us started, can you tell us about the main elements of the argument presented in your new book?
Well, thanks very much, Kent. Always nice to be speaking to an audience over in the United States, and I'm delighted to be able to do so just now. So what I'm speaking to is the argument that I put forward primarily in my most recent book, which is this book here, if you haven't seen it yet. And although the book is an account of Brexit and how and why Brexit happens, it's driven by a particular kind of theory about what is going on in politics at the moment in both Britain and the United States, and indeed in pretty much every developed country. There's only 2 or 3 countries where you can't say that this process I'm describing in the book is happening. And to give us something about how I came to hold these views or put forward this, what started off as a prophecy and has now become an analysis, it actually goes back quite a long way, about 10 years or more in fact, when I became aware that there was increasing strains within what you might call the marriage or alliance between classical liberals, libertarians and conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic. And I became aware of this at a kind of personal level through personal contacts I had, but I noticed that it was gradually becoming more and more acute. I also read a book published sometime before then, which had a big impact on me, The Future and Its Enemies by Virginia Postrel. And I came to the conclusion that essentially something pretty big was happening on what you might call the right of politics, a fraying of the kind of alliance that had formed maybe as far back as the aftermath of World War II, and certainly in the 1960s with the appearance of so-called fusionism, led by the circle around Bill Buckley, culminating perhaps in the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. And so I think since I came to this sort of conclusion, I concluded that this was part of a wider process. And at that time, as I say, this was in the nature of a prophecy, but it's now become very much an analysis, because I think it's now very clear to everyone that something very dramatic is indeed going on the right-hand side of politics in most countries, and that the kinds of political allegiances and alliances that we've gotten used to are all fraying quite severely. This is, as I say, it's a development that's been a long time in the making, but it's now become really, really obvious. I also think that something similar actually is going on the left, although it's not as advanced. One of the things that's actually happening quite a lot in both the United States and most of continental Europe at the moment is an increasingly hostile and tense relationship between what you might call the traditional socialist left and, on the other hand, the more radical identity politics or cultural left. And these two are increasingly at daggers drawn. And I think that this kind of rift is going to progress in the way that the previous rift I sort of described has progressed on the right. You're also seeing a split between both of those groups and what you might call the mainstream liberal part of the left, who are increasingly embattled actually and trying to fight off attacks from both of these more radical groups. Now, all of this is caused, in my mind by a process of political realignment. So what is that? Well, political realignment works this way. In any given time or period, there is a huge array of issues that people disagree about what governments should do in certain areas of policy. And the number of ways you could combine all those different disagreements is almost larger than the number of people on the planet. But that's not what we find. What we find in politics is that politics is always binary. We're always divided as voters and as people interested in politics into two broad camps. Obviously, there's some overlap at the edge, but broadly, everyone knows which of those two camps they're in. And this is true, by the way, for the politicians as well, and it happens regardless of what kind of electoral system you have. The only difference between first past the post and proportional representation is that in a first past the post system, you have two large portmanteau parties made up of feuding factions, and in a PR system, you have two large, broad coalitions of formally distinct parties. But the same binary division is present in both. Now, how does that binary division arise? How do people sort themselves out into one side or the other in the way that W.S. Gilbert famously described 19th century Britain? Everybody either a little liberal or else a little conservative. And the answer, I think, is that at any given time, there are always just one or two issues that are really salient, issues that matter to an awful lot of people. And that's because they typically reflect very profound divisions of either belief or, more commonly, interest in society. Things that therefore matter to people because they affect their direct interests, or things that they find very important. Now, what this does is to produce the binary politics, but the point is that those divisions, and therefore the aligning issues that sort people out in that way, are not permanent or fixed. They tend to change with time. And so every so often, and it seems to be generational, every roughly 30 or 40 years or so, you get a realignment in which the nature of the aligning issue changes. So where are we now, according to my model? Well, I think it's captured in this little chart, which if we could see it up on the screen now, would be good. So this is these are two, if you like, four-way grids, and the bottom axis on both of them is free markets. So if you're at the versus government control of the economy. So if you're at the right-hand end of the bottom axis, you are an extreme free marketeer, and if you're at the left-hand end of that bottom axis, you're Pol Pot, basically, or somebody of that sort. Now, in the old divisions, the division you can see on the left there, the upward axis is a division between cultural liberalism and cultural conservatism and authoritarianism. So if you're up at the top of that axis, you're John Stuart Mill. You basically think that the government should not have any say in how people choose to live their private lives. You're all for experiments in living and things of that sort. If you're at the bottom end of that axis, you think that the state's, one of its main functions is to actually enforce conventional or traditional moral norms. Now, what that produces is a four-way division amongst voters, and the two dominant quadrants are the bottom right and the upper left. They're the ones that contain the bulk of voters. So in the upper left, you have people who combine social liberalism with economic interventionism, social democrats, as I've heard describe them here. And then down at the bottom right, you get people who combine free markets with support for cultural traditionalism and social authoritarianism, free market conservative, as I've called them here. And I'm sure this is the division that's familiar to anyone who knows the kind of divisions that have been fought over between Democrats and Republicans or Conservatives and Labour over the last 30 to 40 years, since the 1970s, really. I should add, by the way, that before the 1970s, people who were on the left economically were actually typically very culturally conservative, if anything, even more so than the free market right were. So that's been the dominant one. Now, my argument is that what has happened in the last few years, or is actually happening at the moment, is that the old division on social liberalism is diminishing in importance dramatically. So questions like gay marriage, for example, are no longer the big division that they were. Instead, what you've got is a new vertical axis, which I think is now the main aligning axis. And this is a division between cosmopolitanism and globalism at the top of the axis and nationalism at the bottom of the axis. And so you now get a big division where the real argument is over things like immigration, trade policy, and above all, the split between an emphasis on nationalism and the nation state and a vision of globalism or cosmopolitanism. And that produces the four-way box you see on the right. Now, I think that in certainly most of Europe, and I believe also in Britain and the United States, the increasingly dominant blocks or poles are on the one hand, the bottom left quadrant, which from my point of view, I would call the dark quadrant, because these are people who are wrong about everything. These are people who combine economic interventionism with cultural conservatism and strong nationalism and anti-globalism. It's not clear yet who the dominant quadrant in the upper part is, but I suspect that for electoral reasons, it's going to be the upper right quadrant, which combines broad support for free markets with strong support for globalism and internationalism. Now, what does this mean in terms of both the US and the UK? What it means at the moment in the UK, as I explain in my book, is that the Conservatives have identified them very clearly with the bottom half of this new divide. And what's going on at the moment is a kind of tug of war between the Conservatives, who are in the bottom right quadrant primarily, and the voters, or a significant number of voters, who are in the bottom left quadrant. Because we don't have PR, they haven't got a party of their own, but they're tending to pull the Conservatives in that direction. Similarly, I think in the United States, particularly since Donald Trump was elected president, the Republican Party has been dragged a long way towards a more interventionist position on the economic axis. And so it again is also moving quite clearly into that bottom left quadrant, I would argue, and certainly is making nationalism its kind of defining quality. Very quickly, finally, how does COVID-19 play out with all of this? Well, I think that what it does is to intensify the conflict on the right between those two bottom quadrants, because the bottom left quadrant, people who fit into that tend to be also strong opponents or skeptics of lockdown and other measures. The people in the bottom right quadrant may be a bit skeptical, but not quite as much or as viscerally. And this is leading to a division of emphasis, if you will. Also, I would say that I think that the current furore in the United States and big controversy about racial relations and the status of the police is also going to mobilize, if you like, sentiment in that bottom left quadrant. And the interesting question is going to be, how will the people in the bottom right quadrant, the more traditional conservatives, react to that? What this also does, of course, and I'll hand over this point, is to put classical liberals like myself in really quite a delicate position, because it's not clear what we should do or what the best or most advantageous strategy is.
Thank you for that. That's a very brief introduction to a book that's packed with analysis. Iain, I want to ask you just to react to the first elements that you've heard here. And I know there's a lot there, everything from Buckley conservatism to predicting the fallout of protest movements to policing in America. But what are the things that jump out at you as most important to react to?
Well, I think that the thing that I would point out as being probably the biggest difference between the UK and the US in this respect is the presence in the top left quadrant, the radical cosmopolitans of a particularly racially based identity politics that we are seeing at its most vociferous at the moment. And my suspicion is that because there is this block that is present there that isn't really as prevalent in other countries, that is going to act as have some sort of gravitational effect on a lot of the quadrants, on the two quadrants around it. So I think, for instance, what we're seeing with the phenomenon of the woke capitalist firms, all voicing support for Black Lives Matter and so on. I think we're seeing a lot of groups that would probably be in the top right quadrant, the cosmopolitan liberals, absent the presence of this group. I think they are being drawn towards that top left quadrant, the radical cosmopolitanism. Now, this is important because the radical cosmopolitanism isn't just about identity. It's also it's also about things like green economics, replacing traditional socialist economics, which were all in favor of heavy industry and shipbuilding and mining and things like that, with a radical form of green economics. And we're seeing the conflict between this. Steve alluded to it in Europe, especially with the rise of green parties and the demise of the old social democrat parties. So woke cosmopolitanism is attracting firms and groups that would normally, I think, be in that top right quadrant, towards the embracing things like green economics. So I think that the big difference between the UK and the US in Steve's typology is the presence of that group. And I think that's going to be a very important distinction between the UK and the US going forwards. Otherwise, I think Steve's got this exactly right. I think this is very much what's happening, and I think it raises a lot of questions for those of us who have traditionally been on the right-hand side of this of these blocks, and how we go about our messaging going forward.
I want to make sure that we understand the mechanics. It's very easy and very quick to get into specific topical, timely issues. Steve, you make an important argument, a distinction, I believe, about cause and effect. And as you describe, there's only one or two major salient issues around which these axes organize. You describe Brexit as a symptom, not as a cause, which would maybe be described as a conventional wisdom of the realignment in Britain. These salient issues, have you seen through history that they bubble up? Are they coming from the bottom, from the people, from the way we live, different and in dissonance with the current alignment, or are they brought to us by political leaders?
I think it's very much the first of those two. I think political leaders typically, if they're astute enough, respond to and identify and then react to the emerging new divisions in society. So I think that it is very much a case of bottom up. I think what you find is either major cultural ideological changes, changes of very profoundly held belief or worldview, or very often material changes in economic divisions within society, changes in class conflicts. So in late 19th century Britain, to give a historical example of that, through the middle part of the century, the really big division of interest that drove politics was between the landed aristocracy on the one hand and the mercantile and business class, particularly the business class on the other, which fed into the classic division between liberal and conservative. And then in the 1880s, you get an emergence of a different kind of division begins to appear between, on the one hand, the wealthy in general, and on the other hand, the emergent organized working class. It began to appear at that time, along with the big disagreement about the British state, and that led to the big realignment between 1886 and 1893. So I think it's fundamentally bottom up. That's the basic cause. But what politicians can do, and this is very important, which is why you can't ignore them, is they can, to a certain degree, if they're very successful, very skillful, identify early on which way the wind is blowing and ride that surf wave, that tide in the affairs of men, to political success and then make the weather. On the other hand, if you're trying to work against what I think is this kind of structural shift, you're not going to get very far.
Now, Iain, if you could, I'd like you to pick up on that riding the tides of men idea and political leaders. You've written a lot about values-based communication. And could you unpack that for us and make sure everyone understands how that fits in with these realigning forces in our political discourse?
Yes, so this was a very big issue for CEI's founder, Fred Smith. He agreed with the cultural cognition theorists, Aaron Wildavsky and Mary Douglas, amongst others, that underlying people's political choices are certain values groups, and that those values groups are in many ways to do with our attitude to risk and what we see as how we see values being under threat when it comes to risk. There are essentially 4 values groups, and these in no way map to the grid that Steve's been talking about, but it is a 2-way grid, a 4-way grid. There is a values group of fatalism. Fatalists basically believe that everything that happens to them, their attitudes to luck, are all based around attitudes to risk are all based around luck. They believe everything that happens to them is a matter of luck, one way or the other, which means that for political terms we can essentially discard them, because fatalists generally don't vote. They don't get involved in the political process. I've noted that if somebody barges past you in a line, a COVID line, not wearing a mask in order to buy booze and cigarettes, he's probably a fatalist. That's just the nature of this particular value group. It's a large proportion of the population, but in political terms, it's we can essentially discount them. Sometimes the fatalists do get motivated, and then some tectonic shifts can happen. But for the most part, there are 3 groups. There are the egalitarians. The egalitarians strongly believe that fairness is the fundamental value. So their attitude to risk is all about what risk does this pose to fairness? Can people escape risk because of privilege, for instance? The second group is, for want of a better term, the libertarian value group, who believe that freedom is most important. When something comes up like a pandemic, what risk does it pose to liberty? And the third group is, the technical term is hierarchist. These are people whose main value is tradition, order, stability, community. When a source of risk appears, what threat does that pose to the community? What threat does that pose to tradition? So as realignments occur, you see some shifts in where these value groups go, because the main issue, as Steve has suggested, the main issue that is motivating politics is it changes. So as identity becomes more important than economics, the value groups shift around. I think that when we look at the reemergence of socialism, for instance, in the United States, we can see that the value groups are realigning there. Socialism is resurgent because people think that the liberal settlement of the past 50 or so years is no longer reflecting their values. They see people treated differently, and this offends the fairness value. They see people denied agency, and this offends the freedom value. They see communities dying, and this offends the hierarchic value. And as a result of which, socialism actually has quite a good answer to each of these three, or good sounding answers, should I say, to each of these 3 threats. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why socialism has become a more popular option now than it has been for the last 50 or so years, because people see socialism speaking to values in a way that the old liberal order did not.
Steve, I'd like you to pick up on a thread here, not the entire theme, but we've got our first question, and we're starting to see the questions flow in, and it comes about fusionism. Mm-hmm. And one thing your model lends itself to very clearly is understanding the core values of the different groups of people, or the primary value of a group of people as they come together in those different quadrants. Is there an opportunity, Alex asks, what can we do to restore American fusionism? And I wonder if you could address that. And we have a follow-on question that I'll turn to Iain for about fusionism in a moment.
Well, I actually think that is very difficult because what I think made fusionism possible was, of course, the presence of an external threat in the shape of the Soviet Union. And so when Frank Meyer came up with the concept of fusionism, along with Bill Buckley, but it's really Frank Meyer's term and idea, the essential argument was that the old division between conservative and liberal or libertarian in the United States, and indeed other Western democracies, was now rendered really a bit trivial by the overwhelming threat of the Soviet Union, the threat of communist revolution on a global scale. And so what that meant was that the differences they had became marginal. Now, I think it's no coincidence that the alliance, if you like, began to fray after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there are all sorts of structural reasons why the third kind of category that Iain mentioned, who are basically conservatives of one kind or another, why they might have trouble with an emphasis upon liberty, because liberty and free markets, if you will, undermines the kinds of things that conservatives want. The basis or essence of a free market economy, a capitalist economy, is innovation. And if you're somebody who really wants to preserve established and settled institutions, then the kind of constant dynamism and creative destruction of capitalism can become actually really quite threatening. And there's also the problem from that perspective or that standpoint that the logic of a capitalist market economy is towards ever higher levels of economic integration, levels and in ways that cut across national borders. So it's very easy to present it as being threatening or hostile to the continued existence of national states or national settlements. Now, I actually don't think that is correct, unless you have a very particular and exclusive understanding of what national settlements and nation states are and should be. But it's still a major tension. And so I think that the logic of the position at the moment is actually to make it very, very hard for both those sides to find a rapprochement or to revive fusionism. The one thing that might do it, though, is shared hostility to the two quadrants on the left-hand side of that axis that I gave you there. In other words, the radical cosmopolitans at the top that I think Iain described very accurately, and the kind of national collectivists, as I call them, down on the bottom left. Because one of the features of the politics of both of those groups at the moment is a complete lack of civility. And I think that, in fact, one of the things that can perhaps create a new fusionism and bring together the bottom right and the upper right quadrants is a defense of civil discourse and what you might call simply straightforward politeness and courtesy in politics. Now, that might sound trivial, but I think actually it's an increasingly important issue. So that's the one area where I think the kind of differences of emphasis that I've just run through might be overruled. And I would add to what Iain said, that I think there's what you can see at the moment is that politics is reorganizing, where it's now the division between the top and bottom of that four-way box that is the really big division, rather than the division between left and right-hand side, between free markets and government intervention. And on both the top and the bottom, what is going on in every country is a fight over how far to the left or right of the conventional old economic alignment the cosmopolitans or the the nationalists go. And so I think what is happening at the moment in some countries is that we could end up with the worst possible outcome if you're a liberal, which is to have the upper left and the bottom left quadrants become the two dominant ones. A choice between nationalists and progressives in the American terminology, if you will. But that's not going to happen everywhere. I think, for example, in continental Europe, we're much more likely to end up with a split between bottom left and upper right. It's still up for grabs, I think, in some of the Anglo-Saxon countries.
I want to start to explore some of those differences between Europe and America again. Iain, we have an insight that I'd like you to react to coming in from a viewer in New York. Jean-Claude asks, or asserts, it seems to me the challenges of the Tories in the UK and the Republicans in the US is to keep the hierarchists and the libertarians in the same party, and more importantly, to vote for the same president or PM. Now, that seems to comport with what Steve was just saying about the key distinction being the vertical shifting or realigning on that axis. Is that right? And what does that mean for the difference between, say, the United States and Britain in one category and the continental Europe and the realignment that's happening there?
I think it's extremely difficult because one of the things that Steve's analysis implies, and he does say this in his book, is that economic arguments no longer convince people. In the past, we could appeal to in the sort of liberal cosmopolitan side could appeal to the self-interest of conservatives and emphasize the economic aspects of the importance of a free and liberal society. That's becoming a lot more difficult because the economic issue has faded away. This is why I often say that the free marketers have forgotten how to talk to conservatives. And in order to get across our ideas, to keep that alignment together, we have to talk to conservatives in a way that is different from the way that we've talked to them in the past. Interestingly, when you go back to Frank Myers, he didn't talk about economics and conservatism as being an issue of economic benefit. He talked about freedom and conservatism as being necessary corollaries, because without freedom there is no virtue, and without virtue there is no freedom. So he talked about it very much in a conservative sense, and because of the emphasis on economic issues over the past 50 or so years, we've forgotten a lot of that. So I think in order to keep this alliance together, if it is important to keep that alliance together, and that may be a big if, then we need to relearn this language of talking to conservatives in a way that they will understand. And I think this is where Fred's values-based communications comes in. We spent a lot of time trying to work out how to make our arguments appeal to egalitarians, and we haven't spent nearly as much time working out how to make our arguments appeal to the hierarchist, to the traditionalist. I think that if we are to keep that alliance together, then that has to change.
Steve, do you have a reaction to that?
Yes, I do actually.
I thought I saw you leaning forward on that.
Yeah, I'm very much in sympathy with what Iain just said there. And I think that to think of it in terms of the political strategy, suppose I was Boris Johnson, which thank the Lord I'm not, sir, and I'm down in that bottom right quadrant, quite a long way up to the liberal cosmopolitan end of it. If I want to win an election, as your interlocutor from New York said, I don't have enough voters in just that bottom right quadrant. What I have to do is to appeal to both the bottom left and the upper right, and it's a very delicate balancing act, how you do that. And the same is true for a Republican candidate in the United States. Conversely, if you're a Democratic candidate in the United States, you're in the upper left quadrant, but you have to somehow appeal to the two neighboring quadrants there. You know, you can always write off the diametrically opposite quadrant. They're never going to vote for you. So the question that Iain is touching on is, how do somebody who's coming from a broadly liberal cosmopolitan position appeal to conservatives? And I think there's two answers I would give quickly. One of them is, you can try and explain liberalism and a liberal society, a market society, as being not just something that you justify on abstract grounds of principle or economic theory, but as being a living inheritance, something that has actually grown up from the past, which you need to conserve and sustain, even though it's an evolving inheritance and not a static one. That's actually an easier case to make in the United States than it is in, say, a lot of continental European countries for historical reasons. So I think that's the kind of language to use. And following on from that, my second point is that what I think, well, actually not just liberals, but all politicians, but particularly liberals, should do is to abandon the use of technocratic language, the language, I'm afraid, that you get from the academic economists. We've allowed the economists to dominate too much of our argument, and had heard less from the historians or the literary scholars or the sociologists, who I think have equally important things to say. And unfortunately, I think over the last 20 years, this is something I say in the book, politics in a lot of countries has come to be dominated by a discourse of technocratic elitism. Basically, that we should defer to the smart guys with degrees from Harvard. And that is not a winning way of going forward for any political persuasion, actually, because increasingly, I think ordinary people are just deeply irritated by this kind of language. So it's not going to get you anywhere.
Does that suggest there's a potential constituency out there for the humanist, the Enlightenment, the remnant that is, we would think of people like Matt Ridley and Steven Pinker, but also potentially in America, politicians such as Ben Sasse, the college leader who came to the United States Senate, who speak in these terms that Steve is describing. Is that limited to the constituency of the think tank community, or is there room for that in the broader body politic? I'm sorry, Iain. I meant to address that to you on humanism.
Yes, I think that the time may have come for us to start looking to the sort of politicians who have a North Star again. You know, the sort of thing that JFK did, you know, for his side of the political divide back in the early 60s. Reagan was extremely good at this sort of thing, providing that North Star without the sort of technocratic managerial elitism that Steve has been talking about. In many ways, people in the UK, from our perspective, they might have been looking for a new Cameron, when in fact that is the last thing that they could possibly need. There isn't really an equivalent figure to Cameron in the US. Perhaps Mitt Romney comes closest, but what we need is somebody who can provide that the point towards that North Star of freedom and community, if we're going to keep the alliance together. I'm not sure that somebody like that has yet emerged. There's certainly been the emergence of political entrepreneurs who have seen the shift towards national collectivism. I think that's what we're seeing in politicians like Josh Hawley, for instance, from Missouri. But the political entrepreneur who can see the value of talking in non-economic aspirational terms to the American voter hasn't really emerged yet from our side. As I said, Ronald Reagan was extremely good at this sort of thing. He always, if you remember his Hillsdale College speech from the 1970s, when he talked about how freedom is just one generation, is always one generation away from extinction. He was extremely good at this sort of thing. And I think that what we need is actually to address that challenge from Ronald Reagan, that communications challenge. How do we communicate the idea that freedom is just one generation away from extinction again? And if we go down some of these collectivist roads, this could be the last free generation of the United States. I'm not sure that there's any one particular politician out there who has yet demonstrated a recognition that that's what's needed.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add to that, I think the problem in a way is that the top half of my box, the cosmopolitan half, is still hugely internally divided, and in most countries has not got its act together, basically. And while that is true up in the top half, in the bottom half, I'm afraid, the tendency in most countries is in very much the wrong direction. The rising force is in the bottom left quadrant. So in France, for example, Marine Le Pen, who is absolutely bang in that quadrant, has basically seen off the Republican, the traditional centre-right, although there are reviving slightly at the moment, but they're still very much now the junior partner on the French right. And so the question is really, can somebody appear in either the bottom right quadrant or the upper right quadrant who has the kind of rhetorical communication skills and that Iain is talking about, to be able to put together a coalition that will basically see off the threat from the two quadrants on the left-hand side? And that's an interesting question. I think it depends entirely, and that is where the contingency of particular political events comes into play, whether or not you do have somebody out there, a political entrepreneur, with the kind of skills that John F. Kennedy or Reagan or other successful politicians in the past have had. And the jury's out now. We don't know yet.
Now, there's from our audience, we have some pushback on the critiques that you have about that expert, managerial, technocratic leadership. Speaking specifically from the perspective of free marketers, Jamie asks, I mean, aren't we better off with Larry Summers and Cass Sunstein than Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, very much so, I would say. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the point. I mean, one of the things, as I said, one of the problems for me, and I think I would say all of us here, with the people in the bottom left quadrant is, as I said, they're wrong about everything. I mean, at least in the past, if you had to disagree with somebody about economics, you could assume that you probably agreed about social issues. Conversely, for me, I might find that I disagreed with somebody about social issues, but I would have an agreement on the economic side of things. But now, there's a growing force in politics where it's totally and often increasingly explicitly opposed to the core beliefs I personally have. So yeah, I'd much rather have Cass Sunstein than somebody like Steve Bannon. Good Lord, wouldn't it take me about a nanosecond to make that choice?
Let me move us to very topical issues. Steve, you've written a good deal about coronavirus. What are the effects on the economic slowdown, the lock-ins, all of the pandemic ripple effects when it comes to these realignments? Does it freeze them in place? Does it accelerate them? What should we expect in the coming months and years?
I think it's accelerating it. I have actually done a number of things about this lately, and one of the arguments I'm making is that pandemics, major epidemics or disasters, wars also count in this category, very seldom actually introduce something novel. What they do is they give a big push or an acceleration to things that are already underway. And so with this pandemic, I think one of the things it's done is it has been very bad for supranational governance. So the EU, for example, has had an absolutely terrible crisis so far. It has lost a lot of political capital and credit in its various member states. And the same is true for a lot of other supranational institutions. The WHO, for example, I think in some ways rather unfairly has been getting a huge amount of stick that is not seen to have covered itself in glory. And conversely, what you've seen is a big re-emergence of the nation state, because it's national governments that have proven to be the effective political agency for trying to deal with this public health crisis. At the same time, also, I think in terms of geopolitics, you're seeing a big heightening of the tension between China and both the EU and the United States. And I have to say that the way the Chinese government has behaved and the way it behaved in the early stages of this crisis was absolutely outrageous. And this has enraged policymakers around the world who privately are absolutely livid about this. And that has led to quite a big reassessment, I think, of how other states think they should relate to the Chinese Communist Party and its sort of larger goals and strategies. So I think what this is going to do is it's going to actually accelerate quite a lot of the alignment, because it's going to give a big push to nationalism. And it's therefore going to add to the tendency for the nation state to become the main focus of politics once again. At the same time, also, it's actually reopening a division in the bottom half of the quadrant, because I think that there is a clear division over how to react to things like the lockdowns and things of that sort. And in Britain, it's quite interesting that the people who are most pro the lockdown until lately, tend to be people who are also very strongly pro-Remain, and the people who are most hostile to lockdowns tend to be very strongly pro-Leave. Now, the reason for that is that you might say, what on earth has that got to do with leaving or joining the EU? It relates to a deeper divide, which is that of hostility to what you might call the metropolitan meritocratic class, who are seen to be the ones who are imposing the lockdown and who are also the people who are generally pro-EU. So what that is doing is actually pulling apart the coalition that I think that Boris Johnson put together and successfully put together in 2019. I don't think it will come apart, though. I think it will actually hold together, but it is causing big ructions there. So I think that's what it's going to do. In going forward, I think the economic impact is going to be very, very considerable. It's not because of the lockdowns, by the way. The evidence that's emerging is pretty clear, I think, that the lockdowns certainly don't help and maybe make things a bit worse, but they're not the main cause of the economic damage. The main cause of the economic damage is quite clearly the virus itself, the disruption it's caused to the global economies, things like international transport, to global supply chains, and the way people have reacted to it. In other words, the spontaneous reaction of people and firms to the threat of the pandemic. And that's why Sweden, which hasn't had a lockdown, has suffered actually slightly a bigger fall to GDP than Denmark, just across the water, which did have a lockdown and is bang in the middle of the European range for it. And so I think the effects of this, particularly because in my view, we're in the early stages yet, I think this pandemic is going to be going for about 18 months to 2 years. It's going to be very considerable. That's obviously going to play out in all sorts of ways in politics.
Iain, it seems to me that several of the things Steve is describing here are the effects on institutions, whether supranational institutions like the WHO or the EU, the institutional effects of people, the way they're reacting to this exogenous shock in the form of a pandemic. Is it decreasing confidence in institutions? And if so, how does that play out for our future on making decisions about the regulatory state?
Well, I think what's interesting is that a lot of the institutions which are showing themselves to be the most fragile are ones that were actually set up reasonably recently. Things like the CDC, for instance, that has obviously had significant failings at the beginning of this crisis, and hasn't really recovered from it. If you'd asked people a year ago which American institution that they admire the most, CDC would probably be pretty high up there. I don't think that's the case anymore. So I think a lot of the institutions that have been set up in more recent years are showing fragility. Some of the institutions that have been around for a very long time, however, are not. So the question is, to my mind, why were these institutions set up in the first place? If they were a reflection of the political settlement of the last 50 or so years, then I think they're going to come under question. The ones that have managed to survive previous realignments, I think are probably going to survive this one. You asked about the regulatory state. As we well know from our colleague Wayne Cruise's work, the regulatory state has just exploded in the last 20 or 30 years. And one of the things that we've been doing at CEI is looking at the regulations that have been put in place that were never needed in the first place, and that this pandemic is exposing as not being necessary at all. I think what we need to do is to transfer our work from those never needed regulations to the never needed institutions. Were these institutions ever needed in the first place? I think that when we look at, for instance, at the Department of Commerce and what it is doing to exacerbate the tendencies that Steve has described about global trade, do we really need a Department of Commerce to get in there and interfere with people's ability to trade and the resilience that trade allows us? If the Department of Commerce is actually making us weaker and more fragile to this this pandemic, then we need to be looking at whether we need a Department of Commerce at all. So that, in broad strokes, is my answer. Well, we have institutions which are getting in the way of our response to the pandemic. If that's the case, we need to be asking whether we need them at all.
I think that's very interesting. I broadly agree with that, but I'd qualify it slightly. I think that there's a mixture of very good and very bad things like to come out of the combination of the realignment we're going through and the impact of the pandemic. The good thing I think is going to definitely come out of it is what Iain talks about, which is the discrediting of an enormous array of regulations. I mean, a lot of regulations have been suspended in the UK, and in many cases, people's response has been, what? We've got this regulation. Why did we have it? And I think it's very unlikely that those regulations will be put back in place. And there's also, I think, a very high, elevated level of awareness now about the incredibly destructive effect of medical regulations by, our equivalent of the FDA has the wonderful acronym of NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and how it actually hampers the development of effective therapies and cures for illnesses. So I think that we actually can look forward to a major move away from regulation as a result of this. But having to qualify that, one of the reasons why I think this will happen is because of the realignment, which is that some elements on the left, if you will, the left in economic terms, are moving back towards the idea of not using regulation, but having simply straightforward state ownership or state control of key sectors of the economy. Because I think the growth of regulation over the last 20 to 30 years has gone along, paradoxically, with formal privatization. And in some ways, actually, I think the regulatory state is more damaging than having outright state ownership. At least in that case, everything's out in the open and very visible. And I think that what you're seeing is because, again, of the pull of that bottom left quadrant, there's a certain kind of left-wing politician in many countries who is reviving old-fashioned socialism in the way Iain described earlier. So we may actually have a world where there's less regulation, but more direct, say, state ownership of key sectors, particularly in Europe, maybe not in the United States. On trade, I'm afraid I'm not optimistic. I do think that one of the things this is going to do is to lead both spontaneously on the part of private organizations to shortening of supply chains, reshoring of a lot of production, because they've become aware of just how vulnerable these complex supply chains are. But also, I think we are going to see a move towards a much more kind of dirigiste economic nationalist policy in many countries. Some countries just can't afford to do it. The Netherlands, for example, couldn't, or Switzerland couldn't. But I think countries like the United States in particular, for historical reasons, that's going to get a lot of weight. So that's an area where I think the outcome's bad. The other thing I'd mention, two other things quickly. One of them is I think we're going to see a major push to reform the welfare state in many countries, particularly in the UK, but also perhaps in the United States. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of people pushing universal basic income as a solution, which I would not be completely opposed to, so long as it was done on a completely thoroughgoing and radical basis. What we're getting, though, I think, are suggestions which would actually be the worst of both worlds. But I think that's definitely going to be a big argument going forward. And it's going to reveal, I think, these new alignment divisions in an interesting way, because that's an issue that cuts across the existing old divisions. And the other thing, I'm afraid, is surveillance. I'm more worried about the test, track, isolate program than I am about the lockdowns in terms of threats to civil liberty. Because I think, you know, if governments get the chance to actually track what we're doing through some kind of app, that is one of the kinds of powers that they are likely to want to hang on to. And with a lot of encouragement from the big tech companies, by the way, because it means more money for them as the people who would supply this. And so I think that's going to be a big, big issue coming forwards. And that is also, I think, going to play in with a new alignment, because it's going to lead to some quite surprising alliances on both sides of the question as to who is in favor and who is against the idea of a more hands-on surveillance state. Because people are going to say, well, if we needed to control COVID, why not use it to control, oh, I don't know, the war on drugs or something like that?
Or not. You know, yes. one of the scrambles we've seen in American political discourse in the last couple of weeks has been there's been a traditional split in the matter of emphasis when it comes to our Bill of Rights. Oftentimes we think of the right of center or the conservatives emphasizing the first two elements of the Bill of Rights, speech, religion, assembly, as well as the right to bear arms, and the progressives, or the left side of the political spectrum, emphasizing the middle portion of the Bill of Rights, amendments 3 through 7 or 3 through 8, which have a lot to do with procedural rights and the criminal justice system. And with the protests, with the rallies, with the lockdown, we're seeing a scrambling of the prioritization of those elements. And I'm eager to see more people embrace all elements of the Bill of Rights. I think you put them together and it's a pretty powerful defense and bulwark for liberty. Before I wrap up, I have a couple notes for our audience. Is there a last word that either of you would like to share? A last idea that you want to make sure to get across? Iain and then Steve?
Yes, I think the most important thing is that we have to remember that those of us who are involved in the business of trying to persuade people that liberal policies are a good thing, we have to remember this is a communications challenge. And so we have to remember that we are not just talking to people who agree with us, but to people who are coming from a very, very, very different values basis. And as a result of that, we have to have a variety of different messages. Yes, the messages should still aim towards the same thing, but we have to understand that we can't just assume that a group is going to be with us anymore. Because of the realignment that Steve has described, that ship has sailed. So we have to be a lot more careful about how we message things.
Yeah, and I would just add to that because of the realignment, as Iain says, you can't assume that somebody's automatically on your side because they agree with you about one issue such as economics. What you're in fact going to find is that a lot of people you thought were friends are now going to increasingly become opponents, and otherwise a lot of people who you were opposed to previously may become your allies in new ways. And what you need to do is develop strategies to go along with that. And I think the basic advice is that, you know, common courtesy and civility and respect for your interlocutor actually goes a long way. And I think people are going to increasingly want that, given the move in the opposite direction that we've been seeing in the last few years.
Very helpful. Thank you both for the conversation. I want to make sure everybody is aware of Steve's book, The Economics and Politics of Brexit, The Realignment of British Public Life. That is out now. It's available on Amazon. Join us again. We'll be back here on June 22nd for another in a series of our webinars, Repeal for Resilience. We'll have OIRA Administrator Paul Ray, joined by our own Wayne Cruz. And then next month on July 7th, we'll be joined for our next book event by CEI Senior Fellow John Berlau and Deidre McCloskey, talking about George Washington, entrepreneur. I hope you'll all be able to join us, and I look forward to future announcements about The Socialist Temptation, which is the book by Iain that I alluded to earlier, due out July 28th. So look for more activity around that as well. To our guests, thank you. To all of our questions and audience members, thank you very much. Please be on the lookout for the YouTube link of this recording. Share it with your friends. We'll see you next time.